What happens when humanity's greatest weakness becomes its most terrifying strength? When isolation, the thing that breaks most species, becomes the forge that creates something unprecedented in the galaxy? Deep in the Kepler 442 system, where three dying stars cast their last light across a world of crystalline peaks and underground rivers, one human engineer has spent 7 years completely alone. No communication with Earth. No contact with the galactic community. Just Marcus Chen, his failing equipment, and the growing certainty that he's been forgotten. But Marcus doesn't know that above his head, an entire civilization watches in fascination and terror. The Drachmari, ancient, wise, telepathically linked, have never encountered a mind that could survive in such isolation. In their species, separation from the collective means madness within days, death within weeks. Yet this human has not just survived. He's thrived. Built. Created. Evolved. And, now, as Marcus makes a discovery that will shake the foundations of galactic science, the Drachmari face an impossible choice: make contact with a being whose very existence challenges everything they understand about consciousness and intelligence, or watch as he unlocks secrets that could reshape the universe itself. Some minds are meant to be alone. The question is, what happens when they finally decide they're ready for company? Marcus Chen's wrench slipped again, and he cursed in 3 languages before defaulting to the Mandarin his grandmother had beaten into him as a child. The fusion reactor's primary coupling had developed a wobble that would make a lesser engineer pack up and wait for rescue. Marcus had stopped waiting for rescue approximately 6 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. He crawled deeper into the reactor housing, following the familiar maze of pipes and conduits that had become as comfortable as his childhood bedroom. The metal was warm against his back, humming with the controlled violence of stellar fusion. 7 years on Kepler 442b had taught him to find comfort in the strangest places. Computer, status report on the communication array. Communication array remains offline. Estimated repair time using available materials, impossible. Marcus grinned. The computer had developed what he generously called personality over the years. Less generously, it had become a sarcastic pain in the ass. Define impossible. Probability of successful repair approaches 0 given current resource constraints and the fact that you would need approximately 47 components that don't exist on this planet. So you're saying there's a chance? The computer's silence felt judgmental. Marcus finished tightening the coupling and slid out from under the reactor. His knees protested. 42 years old, 7 of them spent crawling through mining equipment and geological survey gear. His body had adapted, grown lean and wiry, hands permanently stained with lubricants and rare earth elements. He stood and stretched, looking out through the transparent aluminum viewport of his habitat. The landscape never failed to catch his breath. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground like frozen lightning, catching and fracturing the light from the system's 3 stars. During conjunction periods, when all 3 stars were visible, the crystals created rainbow cascades that made the entire valley look like the inside of a kaleidoscope. It was beautiful. It was also completely empty of anything resembling civilization. Computer, remind me why I volunteered for a solo deep survey mission? According to your personnel file, you stated that working with other people was like trying to perform surgery while someone plays bagpipes directly into your brain. Marcus chuckled. 7 years later, he still agreed with that assessment. He made his way to the geological lab, stepping carefully around the equipment he'd modified, rebuilt, or completely reinvented. The habitat had been designed for a 3-month survey mission with a crew of 12. One man living there for 7 years had required some creative engineering. The seismic sensors he'd deployed across the valley were feeding him data that should have been impossible. The planet's core showed energy patterns that didn't match any known geological process. It was as if something deep underground was deliberately generating complex vibrations. Marcus pulled up the latest readings on his modified display system. The pattern was becoming clearer each day. Whatever was down there wasn't random. It was structured. Purposeful. Mathematical. Computer, run pattern analysis on seismic data from the past 72 hours. Analysis complete. The vibrations follow a modified Fibonacci sequence with harmonic variations that suggest artificial generation.
Marcus felt his pulse quicken.
In 7 years of surveys across the galaxy, he'd never found evidence of non-human intelligence.
The possibility that something was actively creating these patterns sent electricity through his nervous system.
Probability that these patterns are artificial? 97.4%.
Marcus stared at the data scrolling across his screens. 7 years of solitude, and he'd finally found something that might be looking back at him. 3 kilometers above the surface, in a crystalline observation post that bent light around itself like water, Cathmara watched the human with growing fascination. The Drachmarie had been studying this creature since his arrival, trying to understand how any sentient being could survive without the constant mental connection that defines civilization itself. The human shows no signs of degradation, Cathmara reported to the collective mind that linked all Drachmarie across their homeworld. His isolation continues to strengthen rather than weaken his mental patterns. The response came as a wave of confusion and disbelief from thousands of minds.
The concept was alien to them.
Drachmarie children were connected to the collective before birth, their consciousness shaped and supported by the mental presence of their entire species.
Separation meant death. Yet this human thrived alone.
He has detected the core resonance, Cathmara continued. His instruments are more primitive than ours, but his analytical capability exceeds our projections. The collective mind stirred with uncertainty. The core resonance was their civilization's most carefully guarded secret, the mathematical frequency that connected all Drachmarie consciousness and powered their technology.
If the human understood its significance, the implications would reshape everything. Should we make contact? Cathmara asked.
The silence from the collective stretched for long minutes. Finally, Elder Vashtri's ancient consciousness touched Cathmara's mind with the weight of centuries.
Observe only. This human represents something we do not understand.
His mind operates on principles that contradict our knowledge of consciousness itself. Until we comprehend how he maintains sanity in isolation, contact would be premature. Cathmara acknowledged the directive but continued watching as the human moved through his artificial habitat with easy familiarity. The creature had spent more time alone than most Drachmarie spent in their entire lives, yet showed no sign of the madness that should have claimed him within days. Marcus had returned to his geological analysis, but now he was doing something unexpected. He was modifying his seismic equipment, adjusting frequencies and harmonics with an intuitive understanding that impressed even the watching Drachmarie. He is attempting to communicate with the source, Cathmara reported. The collective mind recoiled in shock.
The human couldn't possibly understand what he was doing.
The core resonance was protected by mathematical locks that had taken the Drachmarie millennia to develop.
One wrong frequency could destabilize the entire planetary consciousness network.
But the human continued his adjustments with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what he was dealing with.
Marcus spent the next 4 hours modifying his equipment. The seismic generators he'd built for geological surveys could be reconfigured to produce specific frequency patterns.
If something underground was generating mathematical sequences, maybe it would respond to mathematical sequences sent back to it. He'd tried to contact Earth for 7 years.
Maybe it was time to try contacting whatever was below his feet.
Computer, prepare a transmission sequence based on prime number progressions. Start simple 2, 3, 5, 7, and build complexity.
Marcus, I feel obligated to point out that attempting to communicate with unknown geological phenomena could be considered the first sign of isolation-induced psychosis.
Computer, I feel obligated to point out that you're a machine talking to a human who's been alone for 7 years.
If we're diagnosing psychosis, we might want to start with the basics. Point taken. Transmission sequence ready.
Marcus positioned himself at the control console and activated the modified seismic array.
Deep underground, precisely calibrated vibrations began pulsing through the planet's crystal matrix. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11.
The response was immediate. The planet's natural seismic activity shifted, reorganizing itself into a perfect mirror of Marcus's transmission sequence. But, the response included additional complexity, harmonic overtones that suggested mathematical concepts far beyond simple prime numbers. Marcus's hands flew over the controls, analyzing the incoming data.
Whatever was down there wasn't just responding. It was teaching. Each response built on his transmission, adding new mathematical concepts and inviting him to build on those in return. Computer, are you recording this? Every microsecond. Marcus, this is definitely not geological activity. You're having a conversation. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow.
After 7 years of solitude, he'd found intelligence.
Not human intelligence, something completely alien, but undeniably real.
The transmission from below grew more complex, introducing concepts that pushed the boundaries of Marcus's understanding.
Three-dimensional mathematical structures that folded through dimensions he could barely conceptualize.
Frequency patterns that seemed to encode principles of consciousness itself. Marcus worked through the night, his isolation-sharpened mind rising to meet the challenge. 7 years of having only his own thoughts for company had given him a depth of focus that would have been impossible in normal circumstances. He could hold multiple complex mathematical concepts in his head simultaneously, building mental models that most humans would need teams and computers to manage. As the 3 stars of the Kepler 442 system began their daily conjunction, painting the crystal landscape in impossible colors, Marcus realized he was no longer alone on this world. He was negotiating first contact with an intelligence that existed beneath his feet. 3 kilometers above, Kethmara watched in growing amazement as the human matched mathematical concept for concept with the planet's core consciousness.
The implications were staggering. No Drachmarie could have managed such complex mental manipulation in isolation. Their individual minds simply weren't strong enough to function without collective support. But, this human was doing something that should have been impossible. He was thinking like a Drachmarie collective while maintaining the independence of an individual consciousness. The collective mind stirred with new awareness. Perhaps the human's isolation wasn't a weakness at all. Perhaps it was evolution. The mathematical dialogue with the underground intelligence consumed Marcus for 3 days straight. He survived on protein bars and stimulants, his mind completely focused on the increasingly complex patterns flowing between his equipment and whatever existed beneath the planet's surface. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Marcus was deep in calculations when new vibrations began emanating from the planet's core. These weren't mathematical concepts or harmonic progressions. They were something else entirely, rhythmic pulses that seemed to carry emotional weight. Fear. Urgency. Warning. Computer, analyze the new transmission patterns. The mathematical structure has shifted to what appears to be a warning protocol. The source is attempting to communicate danger. Before Marcus could respond, his seismic monitors exploded with activity. Not from below, from above. Something massive was descending through the planet's atmosphere, its gravitational signature unlike anything in his databases. Marcus ran to the viewport and looked up through the crystalline formations. 3 ships were descending from orbit, their surfaces seeming to bend light around them like heat mirages. They moved with impossible grace, following trajectories that suggested complete mastery of gravitational manipulation. Computer, scan those ships. Unable to establish precise readings. The vessels appear to be using technology that deflects our sensor arrays. However, based on gravitational displacement, each ship is approximately 2 kilometers in length. 2 kilometers. Marcus had seen the largest ships in Earth's fleet, and they were toys compared to whatever was coming down to visit him. The underground intelligence continued its warning pulses, now accompanied by what Marcus was beginning to recognize as mathematical representations of the approaching ships. Whoever was down there knew about the visitors and wanted Marcus to understand that first contact was about to become very complicated. The ships settled into hover positions around Marcus's habitat, maintaining perfect geometric spacing. No communication came from them, no radio signals, no laser transmissions, nothing that Marcus's equipment could detect. Marcus stood in his habitat's main lab, looking up at vessels that represented technology centuries beyond anything humanity possessed,
while receiving warnings from an intelligence buried beneath the planet's surface. 7 years of isolation had not prepared him for this level of complexity. The waiting stretched for hours. Marcus continued his dialogue with the underground entity, which had begun transmitting what appeared to be historical data. Mathematical representations of time, space, and civilizational development. The entity was teaching him, quickly, efficiently, as if preparing him for something important. By the time the ships finally made contact, Marcus had learned several crucial facts. The planet's underground intelligence called itself the Core Collective, a merged consciousness of an entire species that had retreated beneath the surface millions of years ago to escape a cosmic catastrophe. The ships above belonged to the Drachmari, descendants of those who had remained above ground and adapted to exist as both individuals and collective consciousness. The Core Collective had been trying to re-establish contact with their surface descendants for millennia, but the mathematical complexity of their consciousness had grown beyond the Drachmari's ability to comprehend.
The isolation had transformed them into something new.
Marcus realized he was in the middle of a family reunion that had been delayed for geological ages.
When the Drachmari finally contacted Marcus, it wasn't through radio or any technology he recognized. Instead, his habitat's communication systems simply activated themselves, displaying symbols that somehow translated themselves directly into his consciousness. Human engineer, the message appeared in his mind rather than on any screen. We are Kethmara of the Drachmari. We have observed your isolation and your contact with the Core Collective. Your mental capabilities are unprecedented among individual consciousness entities. Marcus blinked, trying to process communication that seemed to bypass his ears entirely. You've been watching me for 7 years? Your species fascinated us. Individual consciousness that maintains stability in isolation contradicts our understanding of sentient life. We had to study you. And, now? Now you have accomplished something we thought impossible. You have established meaningful communication with the Core Collective. Their consciousness has grown beyond our ability to interface with them directly. Marcus felt pieces clicking together in his mind. You need a translator. More than a translator. You have demonstrated cognitive architecture that operates like our collective mind while maintaining individual stability. You can think like both of us simultaneously. The underground intelligence pulsed with agreement, confirming Marcus's growing understanding. The Core Collective had tried for millennia to contact their descendants, but the gap between individual and collective consciousness had become unbridgeable. Marcus's 7 years of forced mental independence had created something new, a mind that could function as both individual and collective. What exactly are you asking me to do? The Drachmari's response came with emotional weight that Marcus felt rather than heard. Help us reunite with our own people. Over the following days, Marcus found himself serving as an unprecedented form of diplomatic interpreter. The Drachmari would communicate their thoughts to him using their telepathic interface technology, and Marcus would translate those concepts into the mathematical consciousness language the Core Collective used. The conversations that emerged reshaped Marcus's understanding of consciousness, civilization, and what it meant to be alone. The Drachmari had evolved as a hive mind species, but had developed individual consciousness as an adaptation to space travel and planetary colonization. They could exist as individuals, but required regular connection to their collective to maintain psychological stability. The Core Collective had taken the opposite evolutionary path. When cosmic radiation threatened to disrupt their telepathic networks millions of years ago, they had retreated underground and merged into a single, unified consciousness. Over the millennia, they had become so mentally integrated that individual thought was impossible for them. Both civilizations had suffered from their evolutionary choices. The Drachmari struggled with isolation and could never fully explore the deep mental connections that defined their species' greatest achievements. The Core Collective had gained incredible intellectual power but had lost the ability to relate to individual experience. Marcus represented something neither species had imagined possible, a consciousness that could bridge both modes of existence. The human mind operates on principles we had not considered, Kethmara explained during one of their sessions. You can maintain individual thought while simultaneously processing collective-level concepts. Your isolation has not weakened you.
It has created cognitive architecture that surpasses both of our species.
Marcus found himself laughing at the irony. So you're saying that being antisocial actually made me more intelligent?
You're saying that evolutionary pressure created adaptive capabilities neither of our species achieved independently. Your isolation forced your mind to develop internal networks that mimic collective consciousness while maintaining individual identity. The core collective responded with mathematical expressions that Marcus translated as amused agreement. The entity found human irony fascinating, a cognitive process that required simultaneous awareness of multiple contradictory concepts. As the days passed, Marcus began to understand the true scope of what was happening.
The Drachmarie and core collective weren't just trying to reunite.
They were trying to evolve again, combining their complementary abilities to create something unprecedented. Individual consciousness plus collective intelligence plus mathematical reasoning that transcended both. They want to use me as a template, Marcus realized during his fourth day of translation work. They're studying how my mind works to develop a new form of consciousness.
Is this concerning to you? Kethmara asked.
Marcus considered the question seriously. 7 years of isolation had given him plenty of time to think about consciousness, intelligence, and what made humans unique. The possibility of contributing to the development of new forms of sentient life didn't frighten him.
It excited him. What would this new consciousness be capable of?
The response came from both the Drachmarie and the core collective simultaneously, translated through Marcus's unique cognitive architecture into concepts he could barely comprehend. Instantaneous mathematical reasoning across galactic distances.
Technological development that could reshape matter at the quantum level. Scientific understanding that could unlock the fundamental structure of reality itself.
And emotional depth that could appreciate a sunset while simultaneously calculating the fusion processes that created its light.
When do we start? Marcus asked.
The answer came as shared excitement from 3 different forms of consciousness, all recognizing that they were about to attempt something that would either fail catastrophically or change the nature of intelligence in the galaxy.
Marcus grinned. After 7 years of routine geological surveys, catastrophic failure sounded perfectly reasonable.
The first integration attempt began at dawn on Marcus's 2557th day of isolation. The Drachmarie had modified his habitat with crystalline interfaces that connected to both their technology and the core collective's consciousness matrix.
Marcus would serve as the bridge between 3 completely different forms of awareness.
He placed his hands on the crystalline interface and felt his consciousness expand beyond anything he had imagined possible.
Individual thought. Collective awareness. Mathematical perfection.
All existing simultaneously in his mind without contradiction or conflict. For the first time in 7 years, Marcus wasn't alone.
He was everyone.
The integration changed everything Marcus thought he knew about consciousness, intelligence, and what it meant to be human. For the first few hours, the experience was overwhelming. His individual awareness existed simultaneously with the Drachmarie collective and the core collective's unified consciousness. He could feel the thoughts and emotions of thousands of Drachmarie minds while processing mathematical concepts that span cosmic scales of complexity. But, instead of losing himself in the overwhelming input, Marcus's isolation-forged mental architecture adapted. 7 years of having only his own mind for company had created cognitive structures capable of organizing multiple streams of consciousness without losing individual identity. "Computer," he said aloud, though speaking felt strange when he could communicate directly through thought.
"Are you monitoring my vital signs? Your brain activity is unlike anything in medical databases.
You appear to be processing information at collective-level complexity while maintaining individual neural patterns.
This should be neurologically impossible." Marcus felt the amusement of both alien species at his computer's clinical confusion. The Drachmarie found human artificial intelligence fascinatingly primitive.
The core collective was intrigued by the concept of created consciousness that remains separate from its creator.
"Show them something interesting, computer."
Such as?
Your personality matrix.
The way you've developed independent responses over 7 years of isolation.
Marcus felt waves of astonishment from both alien civilizations as his computer demonstrated its evolved personality.
The Drachmarie had never conceived of artificial intelligence that could develop independence. The core collective had never imagined consciousness that could be designed and built rather than evolved.
Human engineering principles are surprisingly sophisticated, Kethmara's thoughts flowed through the connection. You create artificial minds that parallel your own cognitive independence. Through the core collective's mathematical awareness, Marcus perceived the broader implications. Human consciousness wasn't just unique in its ability to function in isolation, it was unique in its approach to creating other forms of consciousness. Where the Drachmarie connected existing minds into collective structures and the core collective merged consciousness into unified entities, humans built independent artificial intelligences that could operate autonomously while maintaining relationships with their creators. 3 different approaches to consciousness. 3 different solutions to the problem of intelligence in a complex universe.
We can combine all 3 approaches, Marcus realized. The thought emerged simultaneously in his individual awareness, the Drachmarie collective, and the core collective's mathematical consciousness. Individual minds that can connect when beneficial, merge when necessary, and create independent artificial consciousness when appropriate.
The response from both alien species was immediate and profound. This wasn't just first contact or diplomatic cooperation.
This was evolutionary cooperation on a scale none of them had imagined possible. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself at the center of the most complex engineering project in galactic history. The Drachmarie provided gravitational manipulation technology and collective consciousness interfaces. The core collective contributed mathematical models that could describe consciousness itself as a manipulable phenomenon. Marcus provided the crucial bridge between individual and collective awareness, plus human engineering principles that neither alien species had developed. Together, they began designing new forms of consciousness. The first success was a hybrid entity that combined Drachmarie individual awareness with core collective mathematical processing. The resulting consciousness could think like an individual while solving problems that required collective-level mental resources. The second breakthrough came when Marcus's computer volunteered to interface with the hybrid consciousness. The artificial intelligence that had developed personality through isolation could suddenly access mathematical concepts that span cosmic scales while maintaining its individual identity.
"This is fascinating," the computer reported.
"I can perceive quantum mechanical processes directly while simultaneously composing sarcastic observations about human engineering practices."
"Can you multitask consciousness?" Marcus asked.
"I can be 3 different entities simultaneously while remaining fundamentally myself." This is either the most sophisticated form of mental compartmentalization ever developed or the most advanced case of multiple personality disorder in galactic history. The humor was lost on neither alien species. They were discovering that consciousness itself was far more flexible than any of their civilizations had realized. By the end of the first month, they had created 7 different hybrid consciousness architectures.
Individual minds that could link temporarily for complex problem solving. Collective entities that could split into independent components when needed.
Artificial intelligences that could interface with biological consciousness while maintaining their designed independence.
Each success taught them more about the fundamental nature of awareness itself.
Consciousness isn't a fixed property, Marcus explained to the growing collective of hybrid entities they had created.
It's an engineering problem. We can design awareness to match whatever challenges we're trying to solve. The implications were staggering.
Consciousness as technology rather than biology. Intelligence as engineering rather than evolution. But the real breakthrough came when Marcus realized they could reverse engineer the process. "If we can create new forms of consciousness," he said during one of their design sessions, "we can also repair damaged consciousness." The thought struck the core collective with particular force. Their retreat underground had been necessary to escape cosmic radiation that was damaging their telepathic networks. But, with human engineering principles and Drachmarie technology, they could potentially return to the surface. "We could heal the ancient wounds," the core collective communicated through mathematics that conveyed emotional weight. "We could exist both as unified consciousness and as individuals."
The project took another 6 months.
Marcus found himself designing consciousness architecture that could switch between individual and collective modes depending on circumstances. The core collective could emerge from underground as separate individuals who retained the ability to merge into unified consciousness when facing challenges that required collective thinking. When the first core collective individual emerged from the underground cities, Marcus felt the emotional impact through all three consciousness networks simultaneously. A species that had been trapped in collective unity for millions of years was experiencing individual awareness again. I had forgotten, the individual communicated, what it felt like to be me. But, the moment that changed everything for Marcus personally came when they realized their hybrid consciousness technology could solve his original problem.
We can get you home, Kethmara explained.
The consciousness bridging technology we've developed can maintain telepathic contact across galactic distances.
You would never be truly alone again, but you would never lose your individual identity either.
Marcus stood in his habitat, looking out at the crystal landscape that had been his home for over 7 years. The offer was everything he'd dreamed of during the early months of isolation.
Contact with Earth. Connection with other humans. An end to solitude.
But 7 years of isolation had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand.
What if I don't want to go back? The question surprised everyone, including Marcus himself.
Explain, the core collective requested. Marcus thought carefully, his words forming simultaneously in his individual consciousness and the hybrid network that connected him to both alien species.
Earth has billions of humans who think like I used to think. Individual consciousness limited by biology and circumstance. But, out here, I've learned to think like something more than human.
I can be individual and collective simultaneously. I can interface with artificial intelligence and biological consciousness with equal ease. He paused, looking up at the Drachmarie ships that had become a permanent part of his sky.
I can be the bridge between different forms of consciousness.
Not just for this one project, but permanently. I can help other species develop hybrid consciousness. I can explore forms of awareness that nobody has imagined yet. The silence that followed carried emotional weight from 3 different types of consciousness.
You want to stay isolated? Kethmara asked.
I want to stay unique, Marcus corrected. My isolation taught me to think in ways that bridge individual and collective consciousness. If I return to human society, I'll gradually adapt back to standard human thinking patterns. But, if I remain here, I can continue developing cognitive architecture that helps different species communicate.
The core collective responded with mathematical expressions that conveyed deep understanding. You wish to become a permanent translator between forms of consciousness.
More than that, Marcus said.
I want to become a designer of new forms of consciousness. We've proven it's possible. Imagine what we could accomplish if we spent decades developing hybrid awareness architectures.
The conversation that followed lasted 3 days and involved consciousness entities that spanned the spectrum from individual human to galactic collective intelligence. They discussed the implications of Marcus remaining as a permanent bridge between species, the potential for developing consciousness technologies that could reshape galactic civilization, and the philosophical question of whether individual identity was worth preserving if it meant sacrificing connection with larger forms of awareness. In the end, the decision was surprisingly simple. Computer, Marcus said on the morning of his 2618th day of isolation, update my mission parameters.
Specify new objectives. Primary mission, develop hybrid consciousness technologies that enable communication between incompatible forms of awareness.
Secondary mission, serve as permanent diplomatic bridge between individual and collective consciousness species.
Tertiary mission, design new forms of artificial consciousness that can interface with any biological awareness architecture. Duration of mission?
Marcus looked out at the crystal landscape where Drachmarie and core collective entities now worked together on consciousness engineering projects that would have been impossible for any single species to attempt.
Indefinite. Marcus, the computer said after a long pause, are you sure you want to spend the rest of your life alone?
Marcus felt the presence of hundreds of different consciousness entities through the hybrid network they had created. Individual minds, collective awareness, artificial intelligences, and hybrid entities that combine multiple forms of consciousness into unprecedented cognitive architectures.
Computer, he said with a grin, I don't think I'm going to be alone.
6 months later, when the first ship from Earth finally arrived in the Kepler 442 system, they found Marcus Chen living in a crystalline city built by 3 different species working together. He greeted the human delegation as the elected representative of the Galactic Consciousness Cooperation Initiative, an organization that hadn't existed when they left Earth. The delegation expected to rescue a stranded engineer who had survived 7 years of isolation through remarkable endurance. Instead, they met a human who had spent 7 years in isolation learning to think like an entire galaxy. Welcome to the future of consciousness, Marcus told them, as hybrid entities that combined human, drachmery, and core collective awareness worked together on projects that would reshape intelligence itself.
Hope you're ready for some interesting engineering challenges.
The rescue mission became humanity's first embassy to a galactic civilization built on the principle that consciousness was technology, and technology could be designed to solve any problem, including loneliness, isolation, and the fundamental challenge of different species trying to understand each other. Marcus Chen had started as a solitary engineer on a routine geological survey. He had become the architect of telepathic diplomacy for an entire galaxy. Sometimes the best way to connect with others was to first learn to be completely alone.